Welcome to MSL Talk with Tom Caravela, a podcast specifically designed for MSLs and all things field medical. Hey guys, welcome to the podcast. My guest today is Bobby Faison, Executive Director, Medical Affairs at Paratech Pharmaceuticals, and we talk about why and how to build a community MSL team. Bobby's awesome. I love this conversation. I think you guys are going to enjoy it. Don't forget to follow me on LinkedIn and Instagram, and this video will be up on YouTube as well. And check us out on MSL Talk Live, which is now on LinkedIn Live. That's the first Tuesday of every month at 1:30 p.m. Eastern Time. Thank you for joining me. Hey there, Bobby. Welcome to the podcast. Thanks for joining me, my friend.
Tom, thanks for having me.
This is exciting, man. I haven't seen you in a long time. This is actually the first time I'm seeing you on. I used to run into you at conferences and all that, but first time I'm seeing you in a long time. So I'm excited. Thank you for joining me and for being here. And thank you for bringing up this topic. I'm excited about this.
Well, you know what, Tom, it's a great opportunity. It's something that, now my second company that it's come up as a topic of conversation. And then we've actually, explored what that expansion would look like. So I'm, excited to kind of share my thoughts and my learnings along the way, and hopefully it helps others that are maybe even thinking about the same thing.
It definitely will. It definitely will. So, but before we get into it, why don't we do a quick introduction, let everyone know who you are, where you're from, and all that good stuff.
Yeah. So, hi, everyone. Bobby Faison. I'm an executive director, field medical for Paratech Pharmaceuticals. It's a company that has an antibiotic that's indicated for community-acquired bacterial pneumonia and skin and soft tissue. I've been in the pharmaceutical industry for a little over 20 years, mostly in oncology, hematology, and now infectious disease. PharmD by training, and like I said, I've known Tom a long time, and look forward to the interview.
Yeah, man. Well, it's a long time coming. And before I jump into a quick shout out to our friends in Canada. So the numbers, we get our rankings each week of our listeners, and we've had a huge increase in the number of listeners in Canada. So I want to welcome all of you folks that are listening in Canada. Thank you. And thank you for sharing this podcast. That's why it's been one of the fastest growing podcasts in pharma. So thank you guys, and welcome anybody that's a new listener. So Bobby, you came up with this awesome idea to talk about the community MSL. So let's start with, if you could just describe what that is and how a community MSL differs from maybe a traditional or a therapeutic MSL.
Absolutely. So Tom, before, just a disclaimer that, whatever I say represents my own personal opinion, not those of Paratech. So just want to make sure everyone knows that these are just my thoughts, my ideas.
Cool.
So, specific to the question, as we look into the traditional MSL role, which was largely predicated on engaging top thought leaders, the academicians, educating them on the science so that they would go to the podiums, the major conferences, and talk about your product and share their clinical and scientific expertise. But now, what obviously we're all facing the same thing in changing healthcare environment. It's more focused on who the end users are, and these are the clinicians that are actually seeing the majority of patients, that are now creating their own formularies, pathways, treatment guidelines in a lot of ways. And so as a field medical team, it's engaging that customer segment. So when I talk about the need to have a community MSL team, it's really having a medical science liaison engaging what we now term as these clinical leaders that are largely in these community practices. So it's a little bit of a different slant. So simplistically put, the community MSL is an MSL that largely engages the community healthcare providers.
Makes sense. Totally makes sense. And we're obviously seeing it become more and more popular. And I know you've had a lot of success in building out teams of community MSLs. So can we talk about that model, right? Like, how does that model come into being, and how does a company move forward in that direction?
Yeah. So, maybe if you look at what an MSL does in a broad sense, engaging KOLs and how you define that KOL is probably the driver for this conversation. But then you think about data generation, whether it be investigator-initiated trials or company-sponsored trials, insight gathering, meetings and symposia coverage. So those are your common objectives for a field medical team. And specific to the community MSL, they obviously can take part in a number of these things. But it really gets down to how you define the customer segment. And that's really where I differentiate, like I said, the community MSL from, let's say, a traditional or the academic KOL or academic MSL.
Got you. So you're saying from a strategic standpoint, companies need to first establish where their market is, who they're really ultimately targeting, get into a heavy KOL mapping, territory planning type of exercise, and then initiate how they're going to deploy this team, essentially.
Yeah, absolutely. It all comes down to, resources and how you define the workload. And like you said, if you look at it by customer segment, keeping in mind that the objectives are very similar, then it's really identifying how many headcount you need to identify how many customers.
And just out of curiosity, how did you do that? Were there third-party vendors that you leaned on for that? How does that take place?
Yes. So, in the beginning, when I started this, and this was obviously with another company, we used a vendor, and that vendor obviously provided KOL mapping, and then you kind of identified how many KOLs per MSL, and that kind of gave you a roundabout number of headcount that you would need for that team. Now, quite honestly, there are a number of tools, platforms that you can utilize. I've been a part of platforms like Monocle or H1 or now Viva Link, which is one of the platforms we're using that does a lot of that work for you. So if you have familiarity with utilizing that, you can save yourself quite a bit of money.
Yeah. And it's funny, you look at the medical affairs space now, it's totally different than it was 5-10 years ago, where there's all these great vendors out there that provide such awesome services. And quick shout out to H1. You mentioned H1, they're a sponsor of this podcast. Ariel Katz was on recently. Check out that episode if you haven't already, but they do an amazing job. Those guys are awesome. So I'm a big fan. So getting back to this model, it sounds like the real differentiating factor is who the MSLs will actually call on. So I'm assuming that the engagement strategy differs in what those conversations might look like. So can you talk about that?
Yeah. So even when I say the word community and the community MSL, it's a very complex environment, much like the academic centers as well, and who those key decision makers are. But in a community, you're largely focusing not only on physicians, but also the advanced practice providers, the nurse practitioners or PA, which is a huge customer segment that's exploding. And so you're right, Tom, that the conversation is very different. If you're used to talking to an academician, you're talking high science, they already know the basics of the disease state, and probably more in depth than the traditional MSL. But when you're in a community environment, you're talking to a mid-level, you have to remind yourself to maybe go over the specifics or the high level disease state, where your drug fits, and really focus that scientific discussion to that provider. And each provider obviously would look at it a little bit differently based on their level of experience and training.
Sure. And this is going to be an obvious question. The answer is probably really obvious too, but I have to ask it. So when you're hiring for your community MSL team, are you looking for a diverse mix of talent that would include maybe nurse practitioners and advanced practice nurses and clinicians as you're doing this recruiting?
Absolutely. And so you're going now outside of the traditional MSL role. And if you look at the customer segment and thinking about what that ideal MSL skill set would need to be to engage that customer segment, yeah, you have to include nurse practitioners or PAs that are familiar with the community environment. I mean, these are healthcare providers that are extremely busy.
Mm-hmm.
They're working around the clock. They are seeing, more than 20, 30 patients a day. So you're not going to get the 45 minutes to an hour sitting in an academic's office talking about the science. You have to be very, very focused, and a lot of times really high level in your conversation. Commercial side, they talk about the elevator pitch. I think in the community setting, the community MSL has to be thinking, what's my 3-minute, what's my 5-minute, maybe what's my 15-minute conversation look like? What are the key points that I want to emphasize in this discussion? Because that mid-level or that community healthcare provider is busy, and they're right in the middle of seeing patients. So you've got to be very focused and very sensitive to their time.
That makes total sense. And getting back to the clinic, these clinicians that are in the space as community MSLs, would you say one of the messages to medical affairs leaders looking to adopt this model is to be mindful that they need to put that in the hiring plan, in the job description, to be able to say, seeking either experienced MSL professionals or those with these backgrounds, but certainly not just say, oh, we need PharmD, MD, PhD, but open it up to these clinicians as well.
Yes, I mean, I think that's very, very well summarized and very well stated. I think back here again to the traditional MSL and what that ideal candidate looked like. And it was someone that not only had the clinical scientific background, but had the industry experience.
Mm-hmm.
So knew how to navigate an institution and to develop relationships that were more long-term focused. And quite honestly, those that had existing relationships. Now in a community setting, you need someone that has the clinical experience, that had obviously experience in a community setting, and that can have the conversations with a much broader customer segment of experience, whether it be a nurse practitioner, which clearly are much more empathetic and much more patient focused. So you have to refine that conversation to what their priorities are. To the PA, very similar, and to that practicing physician that now is overseeing a much larger practice.
Right.
Probably seeing the more difficult patients.
Well, and a message, anyone that's listening to this, that's a clinician, that's on the job market, you need to now be changing your search when you go on to whether it's Indeed or LinkedIn or Simply Hired or just Google. You need to use the word community medical science liaison now. Start seeking these positions because you, based on exactly what Bobby's saying, are now a great candidate for those jobs. So keep that in mind. Just a quick public service announcement.
No, it's a good reminder. and maybe we'll talk a little bit about this, Tom, but this might be your entry level MSL. This might be the person that doesn't have that industry experience that we oftentimes sought out, in our traditional MSL role. This might be the practicing clinical pharmacist or nurse practitioner or PA that always wanted to work in the pharmaceutical industry as an MSL, but didn't have that MSL experience. This might be that entry level, and just a point for consideration. It's one of the things I don't have the answer to, but I think about, does this now become part of the career ladder?
Yeah. So a platform. So the community medical science liaison could actually be a really good platform for that aspiring MSL as they're looking to transition into industry. Again, you now need to realize that if you're doing your searches, add that word community before MSL or before medical science liaison. Take Bobby's advice. I think that's awesome. I think people are going to be really excited to hear that there's a lot of people that listen to this podcast that are looking to break in. So let's get back to the engagement piece. So I like all of that information that you were sharing about these clinical practice leaders and the engagement piece. How would you say access differs for a community MSL and a traditional MSL, if it does differ?
No, it differs, and it differs in a number of ways. One area in particular that I've noticed, and this is a general observation, is it does introduce the need for providing a meal. I mentioned that these are very busy healthcare providers, so it's not necessarily traditional that an MSL brings in a breakfast or a lunch. It's oftentimes that's been reserved for the commercial organization, but now realizing these are all very busy people, and the only time that they really have time to sit down and talk with you is over a meal. So you're starting to see, or at least I'm starting to see, the need to provide a meal as a way to not only gain access, but to just have the time to have the conversation.
Yeah. Well, that's great advice. I think people need to understand that that's like an old school technique. I mean, I was a rep a million years ago, and I made a living on bringing in lunches for docs. But because of the Sunshine Act and compliance and a lot of the restrictions, a lot of people are getting away from any act of kindness that includes having to dip into a budget. But you're saying that that's something that is pretty common and relevant in this space.
It is, and it's something for budgetary consideration if you're exploring hiring a community-based MSL team. That is going to be one thing that will generate a little bit more budget concern. Just you typically don't see their travel go up quite a bit, but the meal expenses do go up.
Yeah, that's good.
The other thing with access in a community is something, Tom, we used to talk about way back when. You navigate the gatekeepers.
Yeah.
And that's something that is reintroduced as a skill, just to be aware. How do you navigate a community practice? And being aware that the person at the front door at registration is someone that you have to build a relationship with that can help you meet the people you need to meet with.
Oh, absolutely. That's one of the arts of being a successful field, medical person, is to be able to develop those relationships, know where you're getting your information, who's getting you in the front door, who's scheduling you, how to get scheduled, all those things. So that just, as we're talking about this, just reminds me of the commercial piece of this. And so is the relationship with commercial very different for a community MSL?
So I'll say yes and no.
Okay.
I mean, I think And I think every company and product, depending on where they're at in their life cycle, this conversation waxes and wanes. But in a kind of a traditional sense, even as an MSL that's focused on academicians, that degree of communication and collaboration between field medical and commercial exists. Does it need to exist more in a community setting? I would say generally speaking, yes. And it goes back to what we just talked about, access. Who has the relationship? Now you're in a community setting, you might not be the person with the relationship. It might be that that sales associate that's been calling on that practice for a number of years. Maybe that's the person that has the relationship that, at least can open the door for introduction. So yeah, I think communication is very important between the field medical and the sales associates. And I think particularly in a community-based MSL team, I think that communication and collaboration is very, very important.
Yeah. So what are the disadvantages to deploying a community MSL team, if there are any?
Yes, there are disadvantages, particularly if you have a traditional MSL. If you have a traditional MSL team, and some of the things that I've encountered is that sense that the traditional MSLs are at a different level. And you always, you have some very smart people, whether they're a community MSL or a traditional MSL, that take great pride in what they've accomplished clinically, scientifically, professionally, right? So you have to create that team environment that they see each other as peers and colleagues, and that emphasizing the need for open communication and collaboration. They have to be able to work together. And it's tough. If you've had a team that's been traditional MSLs, that's been focused on academicians, they kind of consider themselves, at a little bit of a higher level than a community-based MSL that just started with the company, that may not have the industry experience. And you can see how that creates a little bit of a challenge, which is why I mentioned, maybe that becomes the opportunity for a career wheel, where that becomes a community MSL, becomes an entry level, and then can advance up to a traditional or academic MSL.
And it makes sense. It really does make sense. But I do think that, just like anything else, when you're a community MSL or a therapeutic MSL, you have an opportunity to stand out, to shine, and to make an impact. So I think it's important to make sure that the value of the community MSL is equal to, in many ways, and shouldn't be looked at as lesser than what a traditional or therapeutic MSL is, based upon what I'm seeing from my clients and from what you're saying.
Yeah, and like I said, it's a work in progress, quite honestly. Learning as we go. Like I said, this is kind of my second time building out a community MSL team. And some of the things that I learned doing it the first time, I've applied it to the second time, but it's a different environment, and they're not necessarily the same challenges.
Right.
So it's just something that I think we as leaders have to be open and mindful of. The other thing is, how do you define the territories? Does the community MSL have a smaller territory, therefore less travel, where the traditional or the academic MSL has much larger territories that travel more? That becomes now something that one might favor more than the other. Maybe I want to travel more, or maybe I don't want to travel more. And so just different things that have gone into this conversation that you just got to make those decisions at what's best for your team and your organization.
And I imagine metrics are different too. I would imagine.
Well, metrics factor in, right? That you would typically think that a community-based MSL can see more people. They go into an office and there's 10 or 12 healthcare providers practicing in that community setting. They should be able to see at least half of them, right? So that the actual key performance indexes, you're right, the metrics would favor more quantitative assessments, but that doesn't necessarily play out, at least what I've seen. And it's, how you put that into descriptors when you're hiring the team and assessing the team. I think as a general rule, MSLs, whether they be community or academic, don't necessarily want to see, quantitative metrics as part of their performance.
Yeah, well, that's true.
It's a tough one. It's probably another podcast.
That's a whole nother discussion. Yeah. Then they get into the, we're not super reps, right?
Exactly.
So thinking about this model, and thank you, like I really learned a lot. This is some really great information. I think this is going to be a very popular episode. Is this model for everyone?
I don't believe so. But you know what? I say that, and then I start thinking about the changing healthcare providers and the changing healthcare landscape, and maybe it does provide at least the argument for consideration. And here again, I think about if I had a product that's, let's say, 1 year prior to launch, and typically that's when your MSL team's kind of ramping up. They're talking to the academic thought leaders. They're really making sure that the awareness of the disease state and reactively about the data that's being pulled together for submission to the FDA. That's what we traditionally did. But the community, the clinical leaders that I talk about, these are the ones that are going to be using your product at launch. So they need to be aware. They need to inform their formularies. They need to incorporate where they're going to put this into their treatment guidelines and their clinical pathways. So I think they need to be as aware the same time the academicians need to be aware, because they have to prepare for how they're going to use the product, because the patients now are going to, now with social media and in the digital space, patients are going to find out that your product's available. So as a healthcare provider, you need to be informed.
Yeah.
So I think it creates the argument that you can't forget about the community space.
No doubt. I mean, the more we talk about it, the more obvious it seems. So I think that there's going to be a lot more of this that we're going to see out there. And because of that, as a leader in this space, what advice do you have for another leader that's about to embark on this type of, building out this type of model within their organization?
Yeah. You know what? I think you've got to know the space and know it extremely well. And then think about clearly defining what your field medical team is going to do and how it's going to contribute to the priorities of the product and of the organization. And I think based on that will help you define or decide, do I have an academic MSL team? Do I have an academic and community MSL team? Or do I have an MSL team that maybe calls on academicians and clinical leaders? Kind of, I hate to use the term hybrid role because that takes on a whole nother connotation, but one that is non-traditional, that's not just on the top academicians. Because we've now introduced, which we used to call it KOLs, and now I'll use that term broadly, the key opinion leader, and we've included now key decision maker into that mix. We've now defined the digital opinion leader, that one that's on Twitter and has a number of followers that talks about their clinical experience. So we've really now defined a much broader scope for a field medical team. And I think each product, each disease state may be a little bit different. And therefore, really defining what that customer segment is for your field medical team will better define what MSL team you need to put together.
Great advice, man. This whole conversation was amazing. Thank you for joining me. That was the fastest 30 minutes I think I've had in this podcast in a long time. That was such an easy conversation. So yeah, man, we got to do this again. I'm sure there's part 2 coming. So any last piece of advice for the MSLs out there that might be looking to forge ahead in their careers?
You know what, and thank you for that opportunity as well to the MSLs out there. And I follow a number of them. I meet them at your meetings and other MSL Society meetings. Think about where these opportunities are. I mean, you've got to do your own homework and, follow these companies where they're investing, and think about what your opportunities, if you're really looking to position yourself to take advantage of these opportunities. You have to really focus on who's really growing in those spaces, and get out and meet people. I mean, I think that's the call to, let's get back to attending these meetings and meeting people face to face. There's just really no substitute to the face to face interactions, for sure.
No doubt. I totally agree. But good stuff. We'll leave it at that. Bobby, thank you again for joining, and thanks everyone for listening. Thank you guys for sharing this. If you found value in it, tell some friends and share it online, or just make some comments on LinkedIn. But I appreciate you all. And Bobby, thanks again. We'll have to do this again.
Thank you, Tom.
Take care.
Take care.
Thank you so much for listening to the show. If you've enjoyed it, please subscribe so that you don't miss episodes in the future, and feel free to leave a rating or a review or a comment. Thanks again, and I look forward to seeing you again soon.